Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming on a could-be snowy day. This is the last in our Thought Leader series before the strategic plan actually will issue. And that does not mean that we are going to end the series. My goal is, or my hope is, that we continue with thought leaders and bring them in and help us really think about important topics that are going to be part of our future. Today, we have Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is a professor at Michigan State. She's director of digital humanities there, but she was actually supposed to speak earlier in our series, but a mishap happened, and she had to postpone to today. She is has an interesting perspective that I think we can all learn from. The reason I invited her to speak was because I read a review of her most recent book in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And her book was Generous Thinking: How to Save the University, which I thought was an interesting title. I read the synopsis of the book, and I thought it was something that we could all benefit from. So we invited her here. She also has written books on the role or the future of the written novel or written publications in the academy and higher education. She has her undergraduate and master's degree from LSU. She does not speak with an accent. And interestingly enough, the head of the English department when she was at LSU was my former boss, Dan Fogel, who actually had come here for the inauguration ceremony. So they had just missed each other. She then went on to get a PhD at NYU and taught for many years at Pomona College in Southern California. And someone told her that the weather in Michigan was just like Southern California, and she believed them. But in between, interposed or insinuated, was a stint at the Modern Languages Association in New York City, where she was looking at the cutting-edge issues that relates to the future of the humanities. So I am not going to stay up here and talk very much longer, but I hope that this helps us really contextualize our thinking for where we can go as a university as part of our strategic plan, and even beyond that, because this is going to be something that is going to be important to the academy as a whole at this very important time in the history of higher education, where we're really reconsidering everything. So I would like to ask you to help me welcome Dr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. So I want to start by thanking all of you for coming out today, and thanking Chancellor Grasso for inviting me and for rescheduling when we had a bit of a mishap in East Lansing. But that mishap has happily resolved, and I'm delighted to get to come talk with you a little bit today. The talk draws heavily on the book that the Chancellor mentioned, Generous Thinking: A Radical Approach to Saving the University. It was published in February by Johns Hopkins. And the overall argument of that project is that the future of higher education depends on institutions and on those of us who are part of those institutions successfully building engaging, trusting relationships with the publics that our institutions are meant to serve. This is perhaps especially obvious for public universities and colleges like ours. But I believe that it's no less true of private institutions like that small liberal arts college that I used to work for, that nonetheless depend on various kinds of public support for their success. That we need to place some emphasis on building these relationships between our institutions and the publics that we serve might be seen in the results of a number of interesting studies like this one that have been released lately. This one came out in 2017 from the Pew Research Center. And this report demonstrates that there's been a precipitous decline in the esteem that colleges and universities are held in the United States, on both sides of the aisle, but particularly on the political right. Now, it's not a surprise. We've seen this kind of shift happening over some time. And typically our response on campus to this kind of report has been to decry the rampant anti-intellectualism in American culture and to turn inward, right? To spend more time talking internally with the people who understand what we do. But in that response, I want to argue that we run the risk of deepening the divide that already exists in our culture, allowing those who frankly want to see us fade out of relevance to say, see, they're out of touch. Who needs them anyway? I mean, it's important for us to remember that this shift in public opinion didn't just happen by itself. It was made to happen as part of a program of discrediting and privatizing public services across the nation. However, from time to time, we are confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, even those institutions that most profess their commitment to public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that the public has placed in them. Which is to say, it's not the problem is not just that the public fails to understand what we do. It's also that we have in many ways failed. We've failed to make the importance of what we do clear. We've failed to protect our communities, both on campus and off. We've failed to build institutions that are genuinely, structurally capable of living out the values that they profess. So a large part of what I'm after in generous thinking is to press for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as in interaction with communities, asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate both with one another and with a range of broader publics about our work. And some focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I would suggest, because our institutions are facing a panoply of crises that we cannot resolve on our own. Now, these crises that are being faced in higher education today don't always give the impression of being the kind or the degree of the highly volatile political, economic, and environmental situation that we're currently living through. And yet, the decline in public support for public higher education is of a piece with those other crises, part of a series of national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good, about the very notion, in fact, that there can be such a thing as the public good. And the consequences of these transformations are indeed life or death in many cases. So while my argument about the importance of generosity for the future of the university may at first appear self-indulgent, right? A head in the sand retreat into philosophizing and a refusal of real political action, I hope in the course of the book to have put together a case for why this is not so. Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I'm asking us to undertake within and around our institutions of higher education have the potential to help us navigate the present crises. I mean, many of our fields on campus, after all, are already focused on pressing public issues, and many of us are already working in publicly engaged ways. But we need to generalize that kind of engagement on campus and think about the ways that it might, if permitted, transform the institution and the ways that we all work within it. That is to say, the best of what the university has to offer, right, what matters most in our culture right now, may lie less in its power to advance knowledge in any of its particular fields than in our collective ability to be a model and a support for generous thinking as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, first, though, who is this we that I keep referring to? What is it that we do, and why does it matter? Now, much of what I've written focuses on the university's permanent faculty, in large part because that faculty is my community of practice, but partially because of the extent to which the work that's done by the faculty is higher education, right? The primary outputs of our institutions are research and teaching. Moreover, the principles of shared governance under which we operate, at least in theory, suggest that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the university. But it's important to be careful in the ways that I deploy this we as I talk. As Helen Small has pointed out, The first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. So while I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but are not faculty, as well as to folks who don't work on university campuses at all, that connection can't be assumed. It would be great if I could make it possible for the we that I'm talking about to refer to all of us on campus and off who want to strengthen our systems of higher education in order to work with us to build stronger communities, to ensure that all of us count. But that building of that larger we is part of the work ahead. So it's important to be careful about that we, precisely because every us always implies a them. Right? And the ways that we define and conceive of that them points to one of the primary problems of the contemporary university, and especially of public universities in the United States. And these institutions were founded explicitly in service to the people of their states or their regions or their communities. And thus those publics should be understood as part of us. And yet the borders of the campus have very often done more than simply define a space. They've determined a sense of belonging as well, transforming everything off campus into them, right, a generalized other. Now granted, sometimes they are imagined to be the audience for our performances, right, the group that benefits from and takes in information that we provide. But what might it mean if we understood ourselves and our institutions as embedded in and responsible to the complex collection of communities by which we're surrounded? How might we develop a richer sense, not just of them, but of the us that we together form? We talk a lot, after all, about community on campus, both about community engagement and about the institution itself as a community. But we don't often talk about exactly what it is we mean by that concept. Miranda Joseph, in her wonderful book, Against the Romance of Community, explores the ways in which this concept gets mythologized or romanticized, and so comes to serve, in her estimation, as a supplementary role with respect to capitalism, filling its gaps and smoothing over its flaws in ways that permit it to function without any real opposition. Additionally, community in the singular, right, the community, runs the risk of becoming a disciplinary force, right, a declaration of groupness that is designed to produce the us that inevitably suggests a them. If, however, we understand community as multiple and diverse, right, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might be able to embrace the notion of community not as a declaration, but as an activity, right, a practice of solidarity, a process of coalition building. It's a way of rethinking who counts, right, of adding others to our numbers and adding ourselves to theirs. And this call for solidarity between the university and the communities outside its walls is part of higher education's recent history, the subject of the student-led calls for institutional change that spanned the 1960s and 1970s. As Roderick Ferguson has detailed, however, those calls were met with deep resistance, not only within the institution, but in the governmental and corporate environment that oversaw it, leading to the start of the political shifts whose apotheosis we are living out today. In reaction, our institutions, rather than tearing down their walls, turned inward. They became self-protective, right? They looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve. Community, in this strategic sense, is and has been the university's weakness, when it should have been its strength. If we're going to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that threaten to undo them, we must begin to understand our campuses as sites where new kinds of communities and new kinds of solidarities can be built. However, In building those relationships, we have to contend with the fact that what faculty members actually do on our campuses is often a mystery, right? And indeed a site of profound misunderstanding for people outside the academic profession, and frankly, even at times for one another on campus. One of the key areas of misunderstanding, and one that most needs opening up, is the fundamental purpose of higher education. Public figures such as politicians increasingly discuss colleges and universities as today sites of workforce preparation, right? As if the provision of career-enhancing credentials were the sole purpose for which our institutions exist, and as if everything else they do were a misappropriation of funds. Now, those of us who work on campus, by and large, understand our institutions not as simple credentialing agencies, but as sites of broad-based education, right? A liberal education in the original sense of the term. Of course, the very term liberal education, so natural to those of us who've been steeped in it, has itself become profoundly politicized, as if the liberal aspect of higher education were not its breadth, but its ideological bent. And so we see, for instance, the state of Colorado working to strip the term out of official state documents that refer to the university. But even where the concept of liberal education isn't imagined to be some kind of cover for a revolution we're fomenting on campus, there's a widespread misconception about it that I think is worse, that it's a mode of education in which we waste taxpayer resources by developing, disseminating, and filling our students' heads with useless knowledge that will not lead to a productive career path. And nowhere is this misconception more focused than on the humanities. Now, the portrait that I'm about to sketch of the humanities today could be extended to many other fields within the curriculum. For instance, the sciences focus on basic science, right, or science without direct industry applicability, is often imagined to be just as frivolous. But the humanities, right, the study of literature, history, art, philosophy, and other forms of culture are in certain ways both the core and the limit case of the liberal arts. The humanities cultivate an inquisitive mindset. They teach key skills of reading and interpretation, and they focus on writing in ways that can prepare a student to learn absolutely anything over the course of the rest of their lives. And yet, of course, these are the fields around which no end of hilarious jokes about what that student is going to do with that degree anyhow have been constructed. Now, the answer, of course, is absolutely anything. As a recent study from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences makes clear, not only do humanities majors wind up gainfully employed, and not only do they, in about 5 years after graduation, begin catching up on a salary level with their peers in engineering and STEM fields, but they also end up happy. But I digress. The key thing to note is that the humanities serve as a bellwether of sorts, right? What's been happening to them is happening to higher education in general, if a little more slowly. So while I'm focused here on the kinds of arguments that are being made about the humanities in our culture today, it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to think of them being made about sociology, or about physics, or about any other field on campus that isn't named after a specific well-paying career. The humanities, in any case, have long been lauded as providing students with a rich set of interpretive, critical, and ethical skills with which they can engage the world around them, right? And these skills are increasingly necessary in today's hyper-mediated, globalized, conflict-filled world, and yet many humanities departments find themselves increasingly marginalized within their own institutions. And this marginalization is related, if not directly attributable, to the degree to which students, parents, administrations, trustees, politicians, the media, and the public at large have been led in a self-reinforcing cycle to believe that the skills that these fields provide are useless in the current economic environment. So someone particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about all those English majors working at Starbucks. Commentators reinforce the sense that humanities majors are worth less than pre-professional degrees. Parents strongly encourage their students to turn toward pragmatic fields that somehow seem to describe a job. Administrators note a decline in humanities majors and cut budgets and positions. The jobs crisis for humanities PhDs worsens. Someone particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about what all those humanities PhDs were planning on doing with that degree anyway, and the whole thing intensifies. In many institutions, this draining away of majors and faculty and resources has reduced the humanities to a means of ensuring that students studying to become engineers and bankers are reminded of the human ends of their work. Now, this is not a terrible thing in and of itself, but it's not a sufficient ground on which humanities fields can do their best work for the institution or for the world. And while this cyclical crisis has not manifested to anything like the same degree in the sciences, there are early indications that it might be spreading in that direction. I mean, where once the world understood mostly that scientific research and the kinds of study that support it are crucial to the general advancement of knowledge, recent shifts in funder policies and priorities suggest a growing scrutiny of that work's economic rather than educational impact, as well as a growing restriction on research areas that have been heavily politicized. So the humanities, again, may well be the canary in the higher education coal mine. And for that reason, it's crucial that we pay close attention to what's happened in those fields, and particularly to the things that haven't worked as the humanities have tried to remedy the situation. Now, one of the key things that hasn't worked is the impassioned plea on behalf of humanities fields. A welter of defenses of the humanities from both inside and outside the academy have been published in recent years, each of which has seemed slightly more defensive than the last. Calls to save the humanities issued by public figures frequently leave scholars annoyed, as they often begin with a somewhat retrograde sense of what it is that we do and why, and thus frequently give the sense of trying to save our field from us. So one might see, for instance, a column published in 2016 by the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Bruce Cole, entitled, "What's Wrong with the Humanities?" Which begins memorably. Let's face it, too many humanities scholars are alienating students and the public with their opacity, triviality, and irrelevance. But perhaps even worse is the degree to which humanities professors themselves, right, those one would think best positioned to make the case for their fields, have failed to find traction with their arguments. And as the unsuccessful defenses proliferate, the public view of the humanities has become all the worse, leading Simon During to grumble that whatever things the humanities do well, it is beginning to look as if promoting themselves is not one of them. Right, and maybe we like it that way, as we're often the ones who take bitter issue with the defenses that have been made of our fields, disagreeing on the purposes and practices that they serve. So perhaps this is a good moment for us to stop and consider what it is the humanities do well, what the humanities are for. So I'm going to start with a basic definition of the humanities as a cluster of fields that focus on the careful study and analysis of cultures and their many modes of thought and forms of representation. So writing, music, art, media, and so on, as they've developed and moved through time and across geographical boundaries, growing out of and adding to our senses of who we are as individuals, as groups, and as nations. So the humanities are interested in the ways that representations work, right? In the relationships between representations and social structures, and in all the ways that human ideas and their expression shape and are shaped by human culture. So in this definition, we might begin to see that the possibility that studying literature or film or art or history or philosophy might not be solely about the object itself, but instead about a way of engaging with the world. Right? In the process, we develop the ability to read and interpret what we see and hear, the insight to understand the multiple layers of what's being communicated and why, and the capacity to put together for ourselves an appropriate, thoughtful contribution to our culture. Now, the first thing to note about this definition is that I'm certain that many humanities scholars who hear it will disagree with it. They'll have nuances and correctives to offer, and it's important to understand that this disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that my definition is wrong. But I also don't mean that to suggest that the nuances and correctives presented would be wrong. Rather, that form of disagreement is at the heart of how we do what we do, right? We hear one another's interpretations, whether of texts or performances or historical events, and we push back against them. We advance the work in our field through disagreement and revision. But this agonistic approach is both a strength of the humanities and, by extension, a strength of the university in general and its Achilles heel, which is a thought I'm going to return to in a little bit. But first, back to Simon During and his sense that the humanities are terrible at self-promotion. So During's complaint, levied at the essays in Peter Brooks and Hilary Jewett's volume, The Humanities in Public Life, is largely that in the act of self-defense, humanities scholars leave behind doing what they do and instead turn to sermonizing, his word, about the value of what they do. He argues that part of the problem is the assumption that the humanities, as we practice them, ought to have any kind of public life in the first place. He winds up suggesting that we should continue to ensure that there's sufficient state support for the humanities, state support in the British sense, right? So that students who don't already occupy a position of financial comfort can study our fields, but that we shouldn't stretch beyond that point by arguing that for the public importance of studying the humanities, because for him that importance is primarily overwhelmingly private. Now, this sense that education in the humanities is of primarily private value is increasingly in today's popular discourse extended to higher education in general, right? The purpose, we're told, of a college degree is some form of personal enrichment, whether financial or otherwise, rather than any kind of social good. And this privatization of higher education's benefits, part of the general privatization that Chris Newfield has referred to as the Academy's great mistake, has been accompanied by a related shift in its costs from the state to individual families and students, resulting in the downward spiral in funding and other forms of public support in which our institutions and our fields are caught, as well as the astronomically increasing debt load faced by students and their families. As long as a university education is assumed to have a predominantly personal rather than social benefit, it will be argued that making such an education possible is a private rather than a public responsibility. And that mindset will of necessity lead to the devaluation of fields whose benefits are less immediately tangible, right? Less material, less individual. So if we're going to correct course, if we're going to restore public support for our institutions and our fields, we have to find ways to make clear the public goals that our fields have and the public good that our institutions serve. But what is that public good? We don't always do a terrifically good job of articulating these things, right? Of describing what we do and arguing on behalf of the values that sustain our work. And that may be in part because it's hard to express our values without recourse to what sometimes feel to us like politically regressive, universalizing master narratives about the nature of the good that have long been used as means of solidifying and perpetuating the social order with all its injustices and exclusions. And so instead of stating clearly and passionately the ethics and values and goals that we bring to our work, we critique, right? We protect ourselves with what Lisa Ruddick has called the game of academic cool. In order to avoid appearing naive or worse, complicit, we complicate, we argue, we read against the grain. Now, one of the things that happens when we engage in this mode of critique is that we get accused off campus of having primarily ideological ends. This is how our universities come to be accused of brainwashing their students, right, filling their heads with leftist rejections of the basic goodness of the dominant Western culture. Now, on campus, of course, we know that's not true. Right, our classes in American history and in English literature may strive today to teach the full range of that history and that literature, but Western culture is far from being marginalized in the curriculum. And in fact, even our most critical reading practices turn out to be perfectly compatible with the contemporary political landscape. In fact, in the larger project, I argue that our critiques of contemporary culture surface not just despite, but in fact because of the conservative-leaning systems and structures in which the university as a whole and each of us as a result is mired. Our tendency to read against the grain is part of our makeup precisely because of the ways that we ourselves are subject to politics, right? Rather than being able to stand outside and neutrally analyze the political. The politics that we are subject to, one that structures all institutions in the contemporary United States, and perhaps especially universities, makes inevitable the critical, the negative, the rejection of everything that's gone before. It's a politics structured around competition, and what historian Winfried Fluck has referred to as the race for individual distinction. So however much we might reject individualism as part and parcel of the neoliberal mainstream, our working lives, on campus and off, are overdetermined by it. The entire academic enterprise serves to cultivate individualism, in fact. From college admissions through the entirety of our careers, those of us on campus are subject to selection. These processes present themselves as being meritocratic, right? There are some metrics for quality against which we are measured, and the best, whatever that might mean in a given context, are rewarded. But in actual practice, our metrics are never neutral, and what we are measured against more often than not is one another. We're in constant competition for positions, for resources, for acclaim. And the drive to compete that this mode of being instills in us can't ever be fully contained by those specific processes, right? It bleeds out into all of the ways that we work, even when we're working together. And hence the danger of those agonistic modes of work that I described. Too often that agon is turned on one another, discrediting competing theories rather than building on one another's work. So this competitive individualism contradicts, and I would say, in fact, undermines all of the most important communal aspects of life within our institutions of higher education. Our principles of shared governance, for instance, are built on the notion that universities best operate as collectives, in which all members contribute to their direction and functioning. But in actual practice, our all too clear understanding that service to the institution will not count when faculty are evaluated and ranked for salary increases and promotions encourages us to avoid that labor, right? To reserve our time and energy for those aspects of our work that will enable our individual achievement. And the results are not good for any of us. Faculty disengage from their colleagues, from the functioning of the institution, and from the shared purposes that it serves, while university governance becomes increasingly managed by administrators. Nothing against administrators, right? But this ostensibly frees the faculty up to focus on that competitive work that will allow us as individuals and our institutions as collectives to climb the rankings, right? This is no way to run a collective. I mean, it's also no way to build solidarity among academic units or across categories of academic employment or between the academy and the communities with which it engages. And perhaps that's the point, right? Perhaps we are locked into this endless competition with one another in order to keep us distracted from the work that we might do if we were truly joined together. The requirement that we continually compare ourselves with one another, that we take on only the work that will serve our own individual achievement, is inseparable from the privatization that Newfield describes as the political unconscious of the contemporary university. Competition and the race for individual distinction structure the growing conviction that not only the benefits of higher education, but also all of our categories of success can only ever be personal, private, individual, rather than social. So how do we step off of this treadmill? How do we find another way to live our academic lives? How do we return to the collective, the social, the communal potential that higher education should enable? This, at last, is where I get to bring in generous thinking, which is a way of being that I propose as an alternative to the competitive thinking in which the academy is steeped. Generous thinking is not intended to be opposed to critical thinking, right? In fact, I argue strongly that the best of our critical thinking is always steeped in generosity. Rather, generous thinking involves the wholehearted embrace of the deepest values of the humanities, among them attention, care, and equity, in order to create communities that can think critically together, both on campus and across the campus borders. So what is it I mean when I talk about generosity in this context? The book obviously spends a lot more time exploring this question, but for the moment, I think of generosity as a practice. Right? It's something that we have to return to again and again. It's an approach to engagement that focuses first and foremost on developing a generosity of mind, right? An openness to possibility. And that openness begins for me by trying to develop a listening presence in the world, which is to say a conversational disposition that's not merely waiting for my next opportunity to speak, but that is instead genuinely paying attention to what's being said to me. It means caring about the concerns of my interlocutor as much as I care about my own. It means beginning from the assumption that in any given exchange, I likely have less to teach than I have to learn. Generous thinking also means working to think with rather than against the people and the texts with which I'm in dialogue. It means starting an encounter with an idea with yes rather than no, right? With and rather than but. Yes and, a concept that gets derived from improvisational comedy, creates the possibility for genuine creativity and dialogue, not only among academic colleagues, but with our objects of study, our predecessors, and the many potential publics that surround us. Yes and asks us to step away from competition, from the race for professional distinction. And when we allow ourselves to linger in that yes and, we create the possibility of working together to produce something entirely new. And it's through working together that we can begin to build the kinds of connections with the publics that might help us turn the tide on the declining esteem that our institutions and higher education in general are held in. This mode of generous thinking is already instantiated in a wide range of projects on campus that are focused on fostering public engagement in and through the work that's being done within colleges and universities. Collaborations with the public can work to create a sense of collective ownership of and investment in the university, making the institution's relevance to contemporary communities abundantly clear. But that mode of working in public asks a lot of us. It asks us to stop disseminating our work solely in the venues that give us the greatest chance at the forms of individual prestige for which we're rewarded, and instead to start looking for ways to make our work a gift to the world. It asks us to accept the risk involved in writing for audiences with whom we're less familiar than we are with our colleagues, finding ways to draw them into our concerns and to acquaint ourselves with theirs. It asks us not just to bring our knowledge to those audiences, but to open space for them to become interlocutors, bringing us their own knowledge in response. And it takes a lot of work, right? Really difficult, failure-filled, scary work to allow ourselves to become open to this kind of engagement. We're prone as scholars to focus on conversations with those we already know well and in forms we already know we do well. And there are times when our attempts to address public audiences or use other forms go badly. I mean, it's possible that Simon During is onto something here when he notes that humanities professors, in the act of public professing, turn away from doing what they do and towards sermonizing about our field's value. But the problem isn't assuming that there's a public value in what we do. In fact, the problem is the mode of sermonizing. Right? Too much professional public address, and I do recognize the irony of saying this 35 minutes into a lecture. Too much professional public address takes the form or the tone of the edifying lecture, instructing the less privileged on better ways of being. If, contra During, we do believe that there is a public value to the work of the humanities, we have to find ways to engage the public as equals without sermonizing. We have to be prepared to accept the vulnerability involved in doing away with the hierarchy of teacher and learner, and to find ways to engage in open-ended, multi-directional, generous conversation. In that conversation lies the possibility of building solidarity with the concerns of the publics we hope to reach, as well as the possibility of encouraging understanding of our own concerns. In that conversation, and in the conversations that you engage in with one another in this spirit of generosity, lies the possibility of creating another mode of being for the 21st century university and those who care about it. In that conversation lies the possibility of developing a new understanding of how expertise is structured and how it functions. And in that conversation lies the possibility of a higher education whose ends are social rather than individual, aimed at community building rather than personal engagement. In all of these ways, in which we engage perspectives other than our own, in which we value the productions and manifestations of our diverse culture, in which we encounter the other in all its irreducible otherness, in all of these lie the best of what the humanities can bring to the university, and the university to the world. So thank you very much.
I'm sure that Dr. Fitzpatrick would be happy to answer any questions. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that were provoked by this conversation. I'll start with one, and then maybe you can add your own. So I'll sit back down, but in the academy, the faculty, by and large, are a guild protected by an ancient form of protection called tenure. So that means that the existential threat that is being posed by society is not necessarily being felt by everybody equally. And so the ones that are typically the most powerful in these societies are not incentivized necessarily to behave in the way that you're describing here. So how do you see us incentivizing this behavior in a system that doesn't necessarily accommodate it readily?
That is an extraordinarily important question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the folks at the top of that hierarchy have succeeded within the current system and therefore see no problem with that system because it has served them well. By and large, not universally true. There are a lot of full professors on campus who, if you talk to them, will declare themselves extremely unhappy with the ways that they are led to engage with one another and with their institutions, and who will express a real desire for doing something different, but a real feeling of powerlessness, a feeling that they can't change anything. By and large, and I don't know the situation on your own campus, but on other campuses that I've visited, when we talk with the faculty about the possibilities for certain kinds of change, for creating new kinds of incentive structures that might make things a little bit different on campus, the response is, the administration will never go for that. They'll never let us do that. And I always kind of want to say, but why not just do it anyway? You know, you can change things where you are without having to change the entire structure of a university. The faculty owns certain aspects of the ways that it works. It owns the curriculum by and large. It owns its bylaws and its departmental working models. It owns a lot of the processes and practices through which faculty life gets reinforced and reinstantiated in new generations. And so if we want to change those things, we can take a really hard look at all of those documents and think about whether they in fact serve our values or not. But doing that work of looking at those documents and doing the revision, doing the kinds of strategic planning that you've been engaged in and are now going to be implementing, it takes a tremendous amount of labor. And it's not the part of the work that we get rewarded for. So I really firmly believe that institutions can transform themselves quite radically if they're able to find ways to build internal reward structures that reward not just the productive behavior on an individual level for which we fill in the faculty activities report or the annual activities report every year, but in fact find ways to reward sustained community engagement, find ways to reward leadership on campus, find ways to reward the kinds of work that are in fact aimed at community building, right, rather than at individual achievement. If we can find ways to reward that through annual merit reviews, through promotion and tenure reviews, if we come to understand that that building of community is our primary goal and reward people based on it, we might begin to develop a different structure and understand what it is to be a member of this community differently. Yes?
I was wondering if you have any examples you could share of a faculty member working in this way, whether it be like with a team or on a specific research project that's engaged with the community to kind of fill out the picture for us.
Absolutely. My mind immediately jumps to a faculty member who just announced yesterday that she's leaving MSU. To go out into the nonprofit sector, which just breaks my heart a little bit. On the other hand, the thing that she's going off to do is really amazing. So Dawn Opel, who is a member of our Writing, Rhetoric, and American Culture faculty at Michigan State. She's an assistant professor there, and she has been engaged in a series of projects that sort of move between sort of human-computer interaction work and medical humanities. And so has been partnering with community medical groups to produce web and phone-based apps that enable better patient communication and care, right? And in that design process is really kind of working toward facilitating real interaction between doctors and patients, as opposed to the kind of 15-minute typing in a computer that you often get when you visit the doctor today, right? She has also taken that kind of work out into now moving from medical humanities into food studies, and is looking at food production and distribution and food scarcity in certain parts of Michigan. And she just announced yesterday that she is leaving MSU to become the director of research and community engagement, something like that, for the Michigan Coalition of Food Banks, to do this work out on the ground in terms of attempting to end food scarcity. So she has, for me, been a model at Michigan State of that kind of work. But I think there are a lot of faculty on a lot of campuses who are doing different kinds of work with communities. And honestly, there are a lot of students who want to be doing this kind of work with communities. I mean, we find increasingly on campus that particularly students who are students of color, rural students, first-generation students coming to college, come with a sense that the education they're coming here to get is not about them, but it's about their whole family, it's about their town, it's about their community. And they intend to take that work back with them. And so they're already deeply embedded, I think, in that sense of education for community building purposes. And I would love to to think about what it would be to build a curriculum around the needs and desires of those students, rather than around the needs and desires of the future CEOs and politicians who, you know, we like to laud as the top product of many of our institutions. So. Yes, hi.
I have a bit of a cold, so give me a little break here. A couple of years ago, about 5 years ago, I was taking a graduate class at a university in this area. I will not mention its name. And it was an art class. It was a printmaking class, and it was in a stacked class. You had undergraduates with graduate students. And we were doing kind of a critique thing, and the critique was moving along, and the professor had cited this one student for having certain symbols in their work, and said that was not, you know, those symbols could incite, and you really need to remove them, and blah, blah, blah. And the steam just started coming up above my head. And I went a little chill for the moment. And now I'm a graduate student in the class with this incident that happened. And being the 50-year-old in the room, because there were a lot of these students, they're 19, 20, 23, you know. I later pulled my instructor aside and I said, what I just heard sounded like censorship. And I don't think that's the role here. The role is to get the student to articulate, why are these symbols in their work? What do they culturally mean? And to take responsibility for that. So when, you know, people are storming the door with the, you know, the torches, that they can deal with the situation. I said, it's not to censor the students' work. You need to help them understand that. And it was just this, how dare you challenge me? And I'm thinking, how dare you narrow the student's view? So my question is actually about, in this idea of generous thinking, where is the role of students, and particularly graduate students that we are educating that eventually are going to come into the professorial role? Mm-hmm. Give us some examples of how generous thinking could change situations like that for our students.
Oh, gosh. So I'm going to counter your example with my example, which is also from a graduate. This is a strictly graduate seminar. It was not a stacked class, and it was one that I taught 1,000,000 years ago in California. It was a graduate seminar in a PhD program in cultural studies that was focused on sort of an introduction to cultural critical theory and what was happening at that particular moment. And I don't at all remember what essay it was that I had brought in that particular day for the students to read, but you know, we get started and I said, okay, opening responses to this essay, what do you want to get on the table? And the first 3 students who spoke issued utterly withering takedowns of the essay. It's like ideological blind spots and its methodological flaws, and it were like complete rejections of what was happening in the essay. And after the 3rd one, I kind of stopped and said, all right, this is all super important, and I want to make sure we get to all of this. But let's take a couple of steps back first. What is the author's argument? What is she trying to do in this essay? And there's complete silence, right? And everybody sort of looks away. And I was young then. I was an assistant professor, and I thought, geez, did I just ask a stupid question? You know, do I now look like I'm sort of pandering and really committed to this neoliberal model of meaning making that they're ready to deconstruct? And it took me a while to realize that that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the students had been armed with all of the tools of critique, right? Of unpacking, of taking apart, of like pulling a text into pieces in ways that would allow them to see its flaws. But they hadn't been prepared to deal with looking at how meaning was produced in the first place, right? And so this took me back to the Peter Elbow model of thinking about how you work with texts. And he argues that it's a 2-part game. And the first part of the game is the believing game, right? To sit with the text and say, what would it mean if this text were entirely true? Right, to take it at its word and to figure out how meaning is produced in this way, and then turn to the doubting game and say, what if it weren't, right? Where are the flaws? Where are the holes? What would it mean if this argument isn't so? And it's only in those two parts coming together that students are really able to get at a deep critical thinking, right? And so a big part for me of dealing with students in generous thinking is to get all of us to take a step back and to start from what is actually happening here. Do we understand what's being communicated through this text or this painting or what have you, to really to open up about how things get produced and what they mean, and then turn from there to critique and how we might work together to make something better. But it's that key step of thinking about working together, right, rather than pulling apart and tearing down, that I think we sometimes lose.
Right, and especially in the arts where the critique is like the thing, that really does take a radical approach, like this generous thinking, to go in that direction. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If we acknowledge that there is this perception towards the liberal arts, whether it's valid or not career-wise in the long run, that the enrollment is declining, why does there seem to be such a resistance to making modifications to address that? Why does there have to be such this system of incentives that you're referencing?
Yeah.
For people to, because in other positions in universities, those incentives don't exist.
Yeah.
This is an issue, you make your modification. And if those changes don't occur, how do you see that affecting the future of a university or of a college and university?
I think some of it comes back to the guild-like approach that we take to the work that we do, that was referenced earlier. I think we have a tendency to carry forward, and I think it's something that, quite frankly, grad school instills in us, right? That we have been trained in the way of producing knowledge, of teaching students, of doing things, right? This is what the field is. This is how I got my knowledge, and therefore this is how my grad students should do it too. And making changes, particularly for folks who have succeeded within a particular way of doing things, right? If you have met a really high standard of achievement, any change in that standard comes to feel like a decline in standards, right? Not just a transformation. And so I think a big part of what needs to happen is some really hard conversations within the faculty about why we do what we do, right? What the actual values and goals that we're attempting to serve are, and whether we're serving them in the best possible way or not. It will inevitably feel, and is there a Chaucerian in the house? Okay, forgive me if there is, right? It will inevitably feel to the Chaucerian as though getting rid of the Chaucer requirement is an utter destruction of the English curriculum, right? Because it is the center of what I have dedicated my life to. You know, so how could you possibly understand anything about literature without this thing that means so much to me? It's really hard to make those kinds of changes because we feel them so personally. But having those hard conversations about what the English major is about, right? What it is we want students to be able to do and to demonstrate and to think through when they emerge from our programs is, I think, the place that we've got to begin. And we've got to find ways to let go of some of those personal attachments and some of those, frankly, undeserved privileges that those of us at the top of the guild hierarchy have been rewarded with. This is not to say that I want to do away with tenure. In fact, what I want to do is extend the benefits of tenure to all of our categories of academic employment, but that means de-hierarchizing those categories. And that, again, is controversial. Other questions? Yes.
contradiction that keeps coming up, even what you just said here. We were talking about we, meaning the faculty, need to look at what we value, but at the same time, as a public institution and forming this community, we need to look at what the public is valuing about us. And if we're looking at what we value and it doesn't match what the public is valuing about us, how are we managing that? And if we're trying to save something about the institution that the public isn't valuing, can we help them understand the value of it? Or do we just get rid of it because it's not what they're valuing it on? It seems like there's a conflict.
There is, and thank you for raising that question because I have not done an adequate job of articulating that link in this particular talk. The last thing that you said, is there a way for us to demonstrate to them the value of what it is that we value? Is exactly where I want to go. And it's particularly important for state institutions, and I would argue especially for the land grant institutions, to really take this under advisement and to understand that our role, wherever we are on the curriculum, ought to be bringing the work that we do out into the public where the public can appreciate it. I mean, they can't care about anything that we do if they don't see us do it. And right now we do all our publishing in venues that they're never going to run across. And their teaching is closed to particular classes. And everything happens here in this kind of veil of mystery on campus. And so what I would love for us to think about is, on the model of the land grant institutions, what would a humanities extension program look like? I mean, how can we take the stuff that we love, the stuff that we have absolutely dedicated our lives to, Chaucer, out into the world, all right, and demonstrate why Chaucer matters today? How can we get people engaged with us in this process? And my model for this, and it is not a model that has been entirely successfully destroyed by the last administration, but is the University of Wisconsin and the Wisconsin idea, which since the late 19th century really understood the university as A, belonging to the people of the state, right? And B, a source of profound knowledge development that could be put at the service of the people of the state. So every academic unit on that campus has public programming that takes the work that they do out into the field. All of the music programs perform in every county in the state in the context of a given year. The English department hosts a, what is the program called? It's something like Great Reads, that brings together high school teachers from every public school in the state to come together and work through a particular text and to talk about how it might affect the ways that they're teaching. And then there are, really deeply community engaged projects like the university, it's CITY, project, which brings together public planning and education and landscape architecture and a whole range of other kinds of publicly engaged fields to work with individual municipalities across the state that are facing particular kinds of problems and to bring their energy and knowledge to supporting the work that those municipalities are trying to do. And in this way, the state of Wisconsin came to really understand the role that the university plays in all of their lives. And so as Scott Walker starts trying to take the institution apart, do away with tenure, slash the budget, break the union, etc., the protests outside the Capitol weren't just folks who worked at the university saying, stop hurting us. It was people who believed that that institution supported the work of the entire state. And if you read the newspaper articles from that time, you'll hear person after person who is a community member saying, you can't do this to our institution. That university belongs to us. And we need to cultivate that. We need to cultivate it by taking our work out into the world.
This isn't really a question so much as a comment, but thinking about generous thinking, I see a lot of parallels in the work I do with design thinking and being able to empathize with different communities as your groundwork for solving problems. And I just think that's really powerful and a really cool concept.
I think there is a lot in common between design thinking and generous thinking. In particular, in that design thinking is not ever focused on solving a problem you think needs to be solved, right? It's a problem that somebody else has. And we as a university have this tendency when we do engaged work in our communities to sort of show up and say, we're the university and we're here to help. And it's sort of parachute in for a brief period of time and leave without the problem really being fixed, or even really understood, quite frankly. And so where we need to begin is with a series of long, hard conversations about what's going on, what strengths the community has and where it's trying to go, what resources the university can build toward helping in that direction, but really focused on what it is the community needs more than anything. And that's typically not the way we've worked.
So I'll just ask one last question, I think. What are your thoughts? I don't know if you're familiar with C.P. Snow's Two Cultures.
Yeah.
And Ed Wilson's consilience thinking around the unity of knowledge, and breaking down really the boundaries, these artificial walls that have been created in disciplines. As you said, you know, we are brought up knowing a certain mode of reasoning, and that is the mode of reasoning that defines our field.
Yeah.
And then we hold everybody accountable to the way we learn, and
Yeah.
then we judge others in other fields differently. So there is this hierarchy in higher education. And what is your thinking about a unity of knowledge,
Yeah.
or a more general,
So
holistic approach?
I haven't read Wilson's work on consilience, though it sounds it sounds useful, and it sounds like something that I would have great sympathy for. I have read Snow, and I feel like that argument about the two cultures, right? There are the sciences and there are the humanities, and they can't talk to one another anymore because there's this great big wall between them. And oh, by the way, the humanists are all conservative and retrograde, while the scientists are, you know, progressive and trying to solve the problems of the world.
But let me just say that the humanists like to refer to themselves as intellectuals.
Yeah.
But they never refer to a scientist as an
No.
intellectual, right?
Right. So it's, I mean, it is this battle, but I also think that there are certain ways that Snow described the battle that created the battle, right? Because people did take sides on his description of who they were and who the other folks were. I mean, I strongly believe that we need to get past those kinds of divides, particularly on campus, right? Where, at least in theory, we're all working toward the same goals. And the more that we can find ways to talk with one another about our work in ways that are mutually intelligible, and in fact that might find some real points of convergence and mutual support, the better off we'll be in terms of the ways that we're able to talk with other folks about that work and demonstrate its importance as well. But, you know, I mean, one of the other great thinkers on higher education, Henry Kissinger, said that the battles are so pitched because the stakes are so low, right? And on some level, it's true, right? We are here trapped within the borders of the campus fighting for scraps. And we've got to stop fighting with each other and start finding ways to communicate and collaborate in order to be able to have any chance of talking with the rest of the world about what it is we do. So.
Well, I'd like to thank Kathleen again for a terrific documenting